All right, hello everybody, welcome. I'm James Leichter from Aptora. I appreciate all of you being here. I think we had a nice turnout for this. On this webinar, we are going to be talking about flat rate pricing. The concept of flat rate pricing, though, is so easy it would take 25 seconds to explain it. What I want to talk about in more detail in this webinar is how we manage our flat rate pricing system back in the office. Question that I get a lot is how do we update our flat rate tasks, especially during these times of tariffs and other things that are causing our prices to increase and change rapidly. And I want to talk about that today, and we will. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them as we go, and I will pause and address those questions. And if it's something that I need to answer later on, I will. So don't worry about asking those questions. Just type those in as usual, or feel free to use your mic, whatever you prefer. All right, let us first look at a document that I have, a Word document that I have. And I'm going to resize this a bit so it fits on the screen a little better. This is an article I wrote on managing and building flat rate pricing systems, specifically with Total Office Manager, but really in general it covers flat rate pricing no matter what system you are using. I should say this, what is flat rate pricing? Let's just cover that really quick. Flat rate pricing is all about presentation more than anything else. It's just offering your customer a price before you do whatever it is you're going to do. A lot of us think of flat rate pricing as being something that we do in the service department, but really the whole company flat rates. Every time you write a proposal for a system change out, that's a flat rate price. Whenever you tell somebody how much a precision tune-up is, that's a flat rate price. Whenever you tell someone how much the service is going to be, that's flat rate pricing. So really, flat rate pricing is nothing more than telling somebody how much before you actually do the work. With time and material, of course, you're telling them how much when you're all done and you've totaled up the parts and the materials and the sales tax and everything else. So that's all flat rate pricing is. Where we really want to get into detail is how you set up the system and how you manage it. And there are many ways to set up a flat rate system in the office. The first thing I recommend you do is create a good truck stock list. You want a list of the things that you need to stock in each of your trucks. Put that list in a Word document, Microsoft Excel. If you're using Total Office Manager, you can create a smart list. I really like Excel for this purpose, and I'll tell you a little bit more why later, but I like to build it in Excel. I like to create a smart list in Total Office Manager to help me manage it once I get it out of Excel. But the first thing you want to do is decide what you want to stock in a service vehicle, also in an installation vehicle, and it may be that you have people that do both. They do service, they do installation, so your truck stock list has to be for the service department, for the install department, but also for both. You might have a plumbing, electrical, you get the idea. Let me share mine with you real quick. Let me bring Excel over here. Make this a little bigger. Okay, so here is a Microsoft workbook, Excel file that I have, and I have a master list here of items that we may or may not have in inventory, but that's my master list. Now from this master list, I identify what is going to be in the truck stock list. So I'll scroll down a little bit. You can see I have the installation, so that whatever part this was, it belongs to the installation truck stock list. We are going to keep it year-round. My minimum on hand is 6. And my maximum is 8, so I wish to have as many as 8. When we fall below 6, then we reorder them to get back up to 8. I keep that information in my Excel spreadsheet for planning purposes. Now, this information can be imported or managed in Total Office Manager, but I like to use Excel to get organized and to think about what I want to put on the truck. When you think about a truck stock list, your goal for the service department is that over 90% of the service calls you run, you can run them without a trip to the supplier. Now that's harder to do in the commercial world, but in the residential world, it should be easy for you to be in the 92, 94% of your service calls. You can do them with what is on your truck, and you don't need to go to a supplier. Unless you are charging your customer full price to go get the part and come back with it, you are losing money on that service call. Most companies don't have enough net profit to cover the cost of going and getting a part and bringing it back. If that's not in your flat rate task, then you're losing money on that trip to the supplier. Also, though, when you're spending time going to the supplier, even if you were being paid for it, well, that's time spent going to the next customer, running the next service call. So it's really important to have a good truck stock list to keep you out of the supply houses and make your service department more efficient. Same way with the installers. We don't want them running around picking up pipe fittings and so forth. We want to build a truck stock list that keeps them out of the supply houses as well. So once you create this master list of items, like I'm in the section where we have our gas pipe fittings, once you create that, then you would use that to build your truck stock list. Here is mine. Now, this particular sheet is for all of them, all the vehicles. So we have one master list, but I have a column in here. I'll show you that column. I have a column in here that tells me this is for install, this is for service, this is for both. Here's my on-hand quantities. The season that I keep them on the truck. Is it year-round? Is it summer? Is it cooling? I call it cooling instead of summer. So it's year-round. It's cooling, heating. Contactor you'd have year-round, for example. A gas valve you might have just during the heating season. All right, unless it's for a water heater. Okay, so now that you have your truck stock list established, now you have the beginning of a great flat rate book, because your flat rate book, you should have a task for every one of your replacement parts that are on your truck stock list. So if your truck stock list has a breaker, if it has a contactor, if it has a relay, if it has a condensate pump, then you're going to want tasks for those items. And when you look at these items, you will notice, like these breakers and capacitors, you will notice that many of them share the same price. That's a good opportunity for you to group up your tasks so that you don't have more tasks than are necessary. So I'll give you an example. You would see from looking at the pricing of these capacitors that they are all very similar. You could have a single task for a residential capacitor. Now, of course, a capacitor could be residential or commercial, but you get the idea. You could have a single task that covers all of the capacitors that you typically would encounter in a residential setting. You could do the same thing with breakers. Certainly, you could do the same thing with contactors, all one pole, all two pole contactors, regardless of control voltage, regardless of load, voltage, amperage. It doesn't matter. They're all about the same price. You can have a single task for those. So that's an advantage of being able to look at these parts. You can sort them by category, by cost, and look for opportunities to group them up. The point, though, I wanted to make is no matter what, you still need a truck stock list. Time material or not, you need a truck stock list. Why? So you stay out of the supply houses. Why? Because when you go to supply houses, you waste time and you almost certainly lose money. Once we have a truck stock list, now we have the ability to build a really good flat rate book, and a small book at that. There isn't any reason why you would need 1,000 flat rate tasks when your truck stock list has perhaps 150 items that you would use during a service call. All right, so let's close that. Now that we have our truck stock list, we can build out our flat rate tasks. But how? How do we build out our tasks? There's a lot of ways to do this. Option 1 is to create a service item. So in Total Office Manager, you have invoice items, as we call them, and there are different types of invoice items. You might remember one of those types is a service item. It typically has no cost because you typically don't buy it, although you could, but you typically don't buy it. You typically use it to drive revenue. Well, you could create a task using the service item type. Your task could be replace a motor run capacitor. You type in the retail price to do that work, and that's a flat rate task. How do you recognize the cost of goods sold? That happens automatically for labor when the technician enters a timesheet, but it also happens when the technician adds the capacitor to the work order, which eventually gets on the invoice. Once that capacitor makes it to an invoice, and the capacitor is an inventory part, once that capacitor gets to the invoice, you then relieve inventory of that capacitor and you create your cost of goods sold. But what about creating additional income? Well, you would have a retail price of 0 on all of the parts. When you use service items, the service item is what determines the price that your customer pays. To create your cost of goods sold, you're adding inventory at the very end. You're adding inventory to the invoice to relieve inventory and create your cost of goods sold. And that's where you get your job costing. Now, in addition to option number 1, using a service item, you could consider option number 2, use a group item. This time you would create a group invoice item type, and you would add to it your labor, and you would add to it your capacitor. The nice thing about that, it has pros and cons. The nice thing about that is it potentially saves time because it has the items in it already. Your technician doesn't have to add items. The con can be the opposite of that. What if it's the wrong capacitor? Then they have to remove that capacitor and add the correct capacitor. So the con is that if that group is not perfect, then somebody's going to have to fix it, and that's the technician in the field. Now, you might be comfortable with that. You might say, our people would be very good at that, but another company might say, no, that would never work here. Our technicians would not recognize it was the wrong part. They wouldn't fix it. We'd have problems. So that may not work for everybody, but that's an option. A third option is to use group item types, but then have the required items added in the field. So you would have a group item for that capacitor, and it would contain the labor, maybe 30 minutes of labor, but it wouldn't have a capacitor. You would have to add the capacitor. So when the technician diagnoses a bad motor run capacitor, they go grab the flat rate task. In this case, it's a group item. They grab that group item, which describes replacing the motor run capacitor, and then they add the correct capacitor. So they might need a 440 12.5 microfarad. They add that capacitor. That capacitor, in this case, has a retail price, and the retail price of that capacitor combined with the labor in that group item creates the total for that task. Now they can present that price to your client, customer, and that works for a lot of companies. Now, the con is that you have to add the item to the group. The pro, though, is when you do add the item to the group, then you're being very precise. You have the exact item, you're relieving inventory, creating accurate costs of goods sold, etc. So you have to just decide what you would want in your company. An example of this, again, creating a group item that has labor in it but not the part. An example of a part number could be this, where you have CTR for contractor, res for residential, REG for regular hours, and TS could be truck stock. So that tells the technician that this task is a residential contractor performed, replaced during regular hours, and it has to be part of my truck stock list. In other words, it's not special order. It's not something that I normally don't carry. So I know there's not enough money in this task to go to the supply house and get it. However, it may see TS for truck stock and I'm out of them. And that's shame on the parts manager for letting that happen. They might be out of them and they have to charge TS rates, truck stock rates, even though they have to go get the capacitor and come back. And that would be a shame because you're going to lose money on that. Now, a nice thing about this is that you can quickly create a copy of it in Total Office Manager. If you're not aware of it, you can open up an item, click Menu, click Create Copy, make a copy. So you could create this task and then make a copy and just change it slightly where you're replacing reg for OT for overtime. So now you have an overtime version. You would then go to the labor item where you might have labor regular and change it to regular OT, which would be sitting right on top of the regular one in your list. So it's fast and easy to do that. Now you've created an overtime version of this task. And remember, this one group item covers all contactors. You could then create another one for capacitors, and that would cover all capacitors. You could create another one for most fan motors, blower motors, inducers, gas valves, and so on and so forth. You probably would only need about 30 to 35 group items to cover all of your major component types in an HVAC service call. And then if you wanted to, you could duplicate that, have the same number for overtime. You're looking at about 70 group items, which would cover everything that you would do. Now again, the group item would represent a category or a classification of parts, such as a fan motor, a blower motor, an inducer, a gas valve, burner control, etc. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Now, there is a final option. Option number 4 would be build your flat rate tasks on the fly from scratch. You could add the labor, add the parts, present the price. You don't have to show those items when you email or print that work order or invoice. They don't even have to show up on the screen, but you could build your own price on the fly for anything. Now, which options should you choose? Probably all 4. Many of you will tend to pick one of those options and rely on it for most of your flat rate tasks. That's what I do. But I tend to use the others as well. They have their place. There are times where a service item is a really good choice for a flat rate task. Going back to the service item type, that would be great for cleaning a coil where I don't need to add any materials or supplies. Maybe you do, maybe you would want to. But if I don't want to add coil cleaner, it's just pure labor, then the service item type makes sense. The group item wouldn't make sense. Why have a group item when the only thing in it is labor? Use the group item when you have items to put in it. So you'll probably end up using one of these primarily, but you'll probably use all 4. The build tasks on the fly is a great choice when you're doing lots of different things on a regular basis. All right, so we talked about the importance of starting with a truck stock list. Once you have that truck stock list, now you need to decide how you're going to build your flat rate task. One thing that you have to consider is management's requirement for reports. When you think about building your flat rate tasks or your inventory system for that matter, you have to ask the bosses, what kind of data do you need from your reports? What kind of job costing do we need? On the income statement, do you need to break out parts and materials versus breaking out labor versus breaking out serialized equipment? Costs of goods sold, is it okay to mix labor and materials for demand service, or do we need to break those out? Those decisions will also change how you set up your flat rate tasks. We should talk about, let me scroll up. We should talk about pricing, changes in prices of things you buy every day and how we would update our flat rate tasks to accommodate this rapidly changing price environment. Well, that's actually easier than it would seem. Let me show you. So here I'm looking at my invoice item list, and I will open up a contactor. Let's start with a contactor since we've talked about contactors before. Here is a typical contactor. Now, before I go any further, let me just explain a couple things about how I set up these parts. The first thing is my numbering convention, or so-called item number nomenclature. I always try to start with 3 letters or 3 characters. Sometimes it could be a number. Usually it's 3 letters. And the letters indicate the item group, the series, or the category that that item belongs to. Is it a motor? Is it a switch? Is it a relay, contactor, etc.? So CRT is what I use for a contactor. The next part of that number would be the second most important thing or attribute about the part. In my opinion, it is amperage. So if I were to take all my contactors and start piling them up, how would I organize them? Well, first thing is I'd organize all the contactors in one pile. Then I would divide it out by amperage. Then I would divide it out by poles. Then I would divide it out by control voltage. There isn't really any reason to put 240 volts on there unless you need to. But I left that off because we don't have any 460. So that's how I came up with my part number, CRT 30, 2-pole, 24 for 24 volt, and that's the description. You'll notice that my markup method is called zero retail price. I actually have a markup type in the software that creates no retail price. The retail price is 0. I could have just typed in 0, but by picking a markup method, which always assures that I have a retail price of 0, then you don't think I forgot about it. You don't think that I forgot to mark up the item. So I use a 0 retail price. That way I can add whatever I used on the job after I'm finished, and the retail price will not change. But I will get my cost of goods sold, I will relieve inventory, job costing, etc. If you're using the item alias feature, then you get to take advantage of the part numbers that your suppliers are using. That way you can put in the part numbers that all your supply houses use, and you can scan their barcodes, or you can type in their numbers, and it will cross-reference with your more sensical number. The reason why I like having a CRT 30, etc., is because it makes sense. That number makes sense, but that part number is not a part number that your suppliers typically use. So that means that when you scan their barcode or type in their part number, it won't recognize that that's a different part number than what you're using unless you use the item alias feature, and that is allowing you to cross-reference your number with the number that all your different suppliers are using. All right, so now that we have that item set up, let's look at the accounting tab, or the inventory tab rather. Notice I have 5 in stock, a total value of $50. So the average cost is $10 on these items. Any task that uses this item then has a $10 average cost for this item. But let's say that the item price goes up due to a big price increase, tariffs, whatever it could be. How does your task get updated? Well, if the task is using this item, then it gets updated automatically. When you go in and order the item and the software says, hey, you normally pay $10 for these, and you backspace over that number and type in $15, the software instantly knows that you're now paying $15. If you have a markup method that you're using, then that markup method will go ahead and recalculate the retail price with a couple of clicks, and you are automatically updating your flat rate system. So again, people ask me the question all the time, How often do you update your flat rate system? How do we get updates to the flat rate system? How can our flat rate system get updated easily? Well, it happens during the course of normal bookkeeping. When you create a purchase order, when you do your item receipt, you enter bills and do all the things that you should normally be doing, the system knows the price you're paying historically and the price you have to pay today, and everything gets updated automatically. Now, I should point out something that people ask about all the time. Well, if the average is 50 and I'm now paying 15 a piece, or pardon me, the average is 10 rather. If the average price I'm paying is 10 and they go up to 15, does it average all that out? Well, yes, it looks at how many you have in stock. In this case, I have 5 at $10 each. But if I buy 5 more for $20, the average becomes 15. The software averages those out in a weighted manner. So it looks at how many you bought at a certain price, and it looks at how many you have, and it averages those out. When you sell out of those items, then your average becomes a 0, so the process starts over again. But that's how it should work. If a $10 item that's sitting on your shelf goes to $15, that doesn't change the fact that the items on your shelf are $10. And based on accounting rules, you can't just arbitrarily change the price that you paid for items that you currently have. That's the key. You currently have them. You can't change those in the accounting system. The accounting system has to recognize what you really paid for them. But as the price goes up, that average changes, and it will be accurate with regard to cost of goods sold. And remember, when you go to 0, the whole process starts over. So if you sell all 5 of these and buy 5 more for $15 each, then it knows the average is $15, and 5 of them would have a value of 75. Okay, so now that we have that item in there, and we've talked a little bit about how an inventory part works and how the price gets updated, then let's talk about the different flat rate methods that I mentioned earlier and look at those in practice. Let's open up a group item that only has labor. So this was option number 3, where you have a group item, like for example, replace residential electrical contactor. You can see the number, CTR, res, regular, truck stock. If I look at the group tab, you'll notice that I have labor, service, regular, and I word it that way for sorting purposes. So all the labors together, all the service labors together, and regular and overtime are right next to each other. And I recommend that you sell labor by the minute when it comes to service work, not an install, but when it comes to selling labor for the residential, pardon me, for any commercial, it doesn't matter, but when you're selling labor for service work, I recommend that you set up your labor items so they're priced per minute. And how does that look? You might know this already, but let's cover it. I'm going to put my cursor in there, and I'm going to right click and go to edit. That allows me to get to that item quickly. Here we are looking at the item. The description is service labor, regular rate, sold by the minute. The rate is $4 a minute. The labor minutes, this is the important part. I have to tell the software the unit that I'm selling. Well, I'm selling 1. So labor minutes, it's 1 labor minute. And that cost me 70 cents. How did I arrive at that? Well, it all depends on what you're paying your people, but unless you know something better, take the average rate that you're paying your technician, add to that your payroll burden, your fully burdened labor expense, as they call it, add to that, divide by 60, and for me it's 70 cents a minute. That's what it's costing me. So my estimated cost to provide that is 70 cents. You don't have to put that information in there, but I find it handy. If you go to the accounting tab, the income account is labor. There's no cost of goods sold account because that happens when we process payroll. That's how I set up my labor, and I have one of those for regular, and I have one for overtime. I also have one for residential, one for commercial. Now, the only thing remaining to do in this task is to add the part. So this was for a contactor, and I just need to add the part to that contactor, and I've got the task. Now, one more thing you could do is you could add something to the end of this task number to indicate how much labor that you think the task calls for. If the technicians need to know that, then I would highly recommend it. I would just put it at the end, something like this, and then that way everyone knows that that calls for 30 minutes of labor. You will pay 30 minutes of labor for that. Maybe it's 40 if it was commercial. You don't have to use dashes if you don't want to. Typically, I use dashes in my group items, and I don't use dashes for my part numbers. My group items, or I should say my flat rate tasks, always end with the minutes because we tend to pay for the task by the minute. So technicians get paid depending on how much time is in the task. That's another story. That's performance-based compensation. So again, that's how you would set up a task where you're adding the item on the fly. Well, then you could make a copy of this and just add the contactor, and now you have a group item with the exact item in it. So there's really not a lot different. You're creating a group item with all the items in it, or you're leaving out the variable item. So you're putting in the labor because it's always 30 minutes, and you leave out the part because you're never really sure which capacitor, which contactor, which blower motor they might use. Now I clicked Menu, Create, and I made a copy of it. And when the copy opened, I just modified it slightly. So I had a overtime version. Let's open that up. This is the exact same task. I just changed the task number slightly so it says OT instead of REG for regular. And then I added to the description. And I don't mind the customer reading this part at all. It says, like the other one did, residential, replace residential electrical contactor, but here's the difference. The work was performed after normal service hours and the technician was paid overtime. Reason why I mention that is I want to build value. I want them to know that the technician got paid overtime for that. You would put that in, of course, if it was true. The labor minutes are still 30, but my labor cost is higher because they're getting paid overtime. I can see my estimated gross margin and so forth in here. Now, I still have to add the item. And remember, until you add the item, you don't know the price. So the difference with this is the technician has to add the item before presenting to the client. Otherwise, they won't know the exact price. But that's not really a big deal because most of the time, you're going to have to add items to your work order anyway. You're going to very likely have to change the items in a group item. You try to get them right, but you're probably going to be changing them anyway. The time that I like to use a group item with every item in it is when I know almost certainly I'm going to need every item in it. So let's say, for example, I'm on a plumbing call and I have a task to replace the tubular, kitchen tubular, and stop valves. So if you think about the sink, underneath it, all that drained stuff, tubular. And then we have our shutoff valves, stop valves, and we have our supply hoses. All of that could be in the group item because if I sell that task, I'm not going to leave any of that behind. I'm not going to leave a piece of tubular because it looks good, that's in good shape. I'm going to get rid of all of that and replace it. Well, that would make sense to have all of those items in a group. But when it comes to a contactor, or especially a capacitor, I might have 12 capacitors that all would be priced out the same, if not extremely close. It makes sense to add the right component. All right, so I'll close that. Now again, how does that get updated? How do your tasks get updated? Depending on how you set up your flat rate system, you're updating the pricing of your tasks as you're doing your bookkeeping. Now, in our software, Total Office Manager, we don't allow prices on items to update automatically when you update the price you pay. When you open up an item, you might notice that there's a markup method, there's a retail price. You have to click a button to make that happen. But there is a utility that makes it easy. If you come into your item list and sort it out by category, by whatever you want, sort it out, select what you want to change, go to Actions, and go to Update Retail Price. And this form will pop up, giving you an opportunity to update all of those items with a click of a button. You even have the opportunity to change or set the markup method, and you've got other options here. But this utility makes it easy to change the retail price of your items. Why do we do it like this? Why don't we just automatically update them? We don't want technicians in the field or people in the other office. There could be somebody in the other office working on an estimate or an invoice. We don't want people in the middle of their work to see the price change, which could theoretically happen. I could say to you, your total investment is $862.51, and all of a sudden that becomes $938.42. As I'm standing there looking at my tablet. Well, we don't want that to happen. So what you would do is you would update your retail price as needed, but after hours. It could be tonight because you've done a lot of data entry and prices have changed. It could be every Friday. You could just have a rule in your company that every Friday at 5:30 p.m. people run this utility. But that's how you update your pricing. Otherwise, it doesn't happen automatically by design. Now, a lot of people have trouble searching for tasks in mobile. So they go into Aptora Mobile and they tell me it's really hard to find things. In fact, the biggest complaint we get about our mobile app is it's hard to find things. Now, every time somebody says that to me, I'm always able to give at least what I am told is an acceptable answer. There are some tips about searching for things inside mobile, but I can tell you that it's most important that your items have a logical description. In your description, you want to be consistent. You see how I have 3/8 of an inch? So here I have 3/8 of an inch. But you know what? I don't. I have 3/8 of a foot, because that's a single quote, not a double. Now, I did that on purpose because I often search for this and I show people how I can't find it. And I make the point that some of the items have the inch and some of them have a foot by mistake. We have to be consistent with how we describe everything. Now, that can take some time, so it's really important to have good categories. In mobile, when you go to search for an item, you could first filter by category. So I recommend that you first spend time creating good item categories. Let me show you mine. It can be done quickly. I decided to create a category for HVACR service and then another category for plumbing, since I'm doing both, and then I have another for electrical. You may not need to do that at all. You could avoid having this parent called HVACR service. The reason why I put number 1 in front of it is for sorting. It's the most likely thing you're going to be looking at, so I put the number 1 there to make it at the top of the list. But if you were looking for a contactor, it's pretty easy. You can see contactors, relays, and transformers. If you're looking for a task related to cleaning the burner, it's pretty easy. Go to heating, burner. If you're looking for charging, it's pretty simple. Thermostats, I decided to divide the thermostats out a bit. Normally I wouldn't do this. Like, for example, my category for capacitors is simply capacitors. We just don't have enough to justify run versus start versus combination, universal. But when it came to thermostats, I decided to break it out a little bit, non-programmable, programmable, Wi-Fi, etc. So my recommendation to help with searching is to create really good task and item categories. After that because you get the most bang for your buck. After that, try to go in and update your item descriptions so that they are consistent and people know how to search. If you have half space HP, that is not the same thing as half HP, and it will confuse people. Now, you can export your items to Excel, clean them up, and re-import them using the import utility. So keep that in mind. That might make it a whole lot easier. Let's look at the diagnostic fees that I have set up. And I will open up the most common, and that would be my residential normal working hours. All right, so let's say that you have a travel fee, diagnostic fee, whatever you want to call it. You might have travel and diagnostic fee in your description, but just give it a good description. You'll want to create a diagnostic fee. Notice my category. I have a category called labor, trip, and diagnostic fees, so they're easy to find. I use a numbering convention that makes sense once it's explained anyway, so it's easy to go find that. I've got consistent descriptions. The rate, $89. Labor minutes, 60. What does that mean? Well, that means that I expect this process to average 60 minutes. It should take you 60 minutes to get there and figure out what's wrong, and that's what you get paid. And if you replace the contactor that we saw earlier, you get 30 more minutes. What does that cost me? Well, then you put in the rate that you think it's going to cost you. On the accounting tab, you point it at the correct income account. For me, it's flat rate income. And check the little box down here that says, I am a diagnostic fee. Now the software understands this is a diagnostic fee. What does it do with that? It's able to count up how many diagnostic fees each technician had. It can look at how many technicians created an invoice, or which technicians created an invoice that only had a diagnostic fee on it, etc. So there's a lot of good information. If you forgot to check that box, no harm done. Just open this and check the box, and it will be like it's been checked forever. This is a commonly used item. On all of the items and tasks that your company uses on a regular basis, I recommend you check that box. That will make it easier to find those things in mobile. You'll be able to go to your commonly used at the top, click that, and you'll see all the most common items, tasks, etc. Check that box. One thing that I forgot to mention about item categories, I said that you get the most bang for your labor buck, your effort buck. I forgot to mention that once you put in those categories, you can come back to the invoice item list, and then you can search for these items and highlight them. So imagine I highlighted all of my motors or capacitors, or in this case, diagnostic fees. I can go to Actions. I can go to Batch Update. This form opens up. Bring it over to this screen. And I can change the category, among many other things. I can change the category now to the correct category. Labor, trip, diagnostic fees. That's what I have it set at already. But that's how I would change it. Click Update. It's going to ask, am I sure? And if they weren't in that category, they are now. So imagine going through your capacitors, motors, inducers, burner components. You could get through that stuff really quickly, and the technicians will be thrilled because once you show them, if they don't know it, they can pick a category. How many items do you have in a category? Probably not that many. That'll really help with searching. One thing I want to mention that's related to this, but not directly, is how to handle use tax. It came up in a coaching call today with one of my clients. How do we handle use tax? So the question that he asked was, when we go buy things at the supplier, we are paying tax, use tax. If we are buying those things for a job, it's easy for us to pick the customer's name on the bill and get that job costed, right? But what if we are buying items for inventory? We're buying items for stock and we're paying use tax. There's no customer to select. So that doesn't get job costed, but use tax could be 7%, could be as much as 10% for some of you. That is too big a number to not get on your job costing. You can call it a cost of goods sold, and you should, but it doesn't mean that it gets on your job costing reports, because in this scenario, we wouldn't have had a job name. So how do we handle that? If you're not aware of it, here's how you do it. Let's do a new bill. And you can see that I have a add sales tax feature right here. And that could say add sales tax, use tax. It says add sales tax. I can type in a rate and click one of two buttons. So how would this work? Well, let's say that you're buying this part here, and you're buying another part. Let's grab another one. It's paying a tariff. And whether you knew it was broken out or not, it still means that you're paying more for the item. So let's say it was 10%. Instead of that item being $266, it's $266 plus 26.6 cents. It would make sense to just add 10%, add the use tax to each item, because that's what you're paying for it anyway. Well, if you like that idea, then you can type in the 10% or whatever your rate is, and you can click the apply to selected, which would apply to only the items that you've selected, or apply to all. Click that button, and it added the 10% to the amount that you pay. So that's the cost going up by 10%. Now, when you put that item into inventory, the average cost of the item is what you paid plus the use tax, but that's what you ultimately paid. Now, again, you may not like that idea for some reason, but most people that I show it to that are in the accounting field are really thrilled to see it. They think it's weird at first, and then they're like, that's brilliant, because that is really what's happening. I'm not paying the former price, I'm paying the latter price, and it's nice to just add that to those items. So that takes care of your job costing, because now the items accurately reflect what you ultimately paid for them. And remember, when you buy those, if you don't have any in stock, that becomes the average cost for each of those items. And if you have some in stock, then they get averaged out in a weighted manner, so it's accurate. All right. So the important thing about flat rate pricing when it comes to the back office, getting it set up, is deciding first what kind of reports do you need, because the reports tend to drive the decisions you make on how to set up an actual flat rate task. The next thing that I want to share with you is how to solve a problem that many of us have, and that is our technicians don't do a good job of filling out the work order, which ultimately becomes the invoice. They don't do a good job of filling out the work order explaining what they did. So what I want to suggest to you is that you don't really rely on the task description as much as you rely on a pre-written description that they will add in the field to their work orders. So again, when you pick a task such as a motor replacement, it'll have a short description on it, and that may not be adequate. You may want your technician to write a narrative. Maybe they told the person that they should do this, but the person declined it. Or maybe they recommended a leak search and it was declined. What you want to do is write out all of those descriptions in advance. And let me show you mine. Make this screen bigger here. Okay, so here's my document for prepared HVAC service descriptions. And I talk about the how and the why, but I'll just get to it. Here are the descriptions for the diagnostic results. Once we do our diagnostics, we have two sets of results. We have the absolutely required repairs. These are the repairs that we absolutely have to do to take care of the problem that you described when you contacted us. So you called and said, no cooling. I don't have any cooling. My cooling system stopped functioning. My absolutely required repairs are the bare minimum to get your system back to what it was right before it failed. So that might be replacing the fan motor, but not cleaning the evaporator coil, because the coil has been getting dirty for a long time. But the fan motor failed last night, and that's why you called us. That is my absolutely required repairs diagnostic. Now, once we take care of that, and I've got that repair finished, and I've put you back to where you were moments ago when the system failed, now that that money is in my pocket, if you will, I want to recommend other things. And those things might be extremely important. They might not be all that important. It just depends on what they are. But now you have your highly recommended repairs. These are repairs that are not absolutely required, but highly recommended for maximum system capacity, airflow, safety, efficiency, reliability, longevity, and peak performance. With that said, we write all these descriptions out in advance. We put in a lot of information without being too specific. So you want to avoid horsepower, volts, amps, specifications. That way you can thoroughly describe a condensing unit motor replacement and the process that you went through to diagnose the motor being faulty. You can write all that out and use it for nearly any motor, because I haven't gotten into specifics. I might have different scenarios, like you'll notice I have a version 1 of this description, and I have a version 2 of it, and a version 3. Replace a run capacitor, there's the description. Replace a start capacitor, start gear. Now here's safety controls. Replace a safety pressure switch, contactors, relays, minor wire repair, reset a breaker. Notice that reset a breaker has quite a bit to it, even though you're not doing much. That's a dangerous thing to do, reset a breaker, right? Chances are you're coming back to reset it again, you're going to look stupid. So we want to really describe our thought process. Why did I reset the breaker and call it a day? I really want to describe my thought process so the technician would pick this from a list in our app. And that feature is in there, as you may know. So I have reset a breaker, replace the breaker, again, my thought process, a fuse, etc. Now, one thing I really like is the section on professional recommendations. This is when we don't have anything to recommend that's really important. And we are recommending things that aren't necessarily important, but we think that you should consider them. This section has things like a whole house humidification system, programmable thermostats, Wi-Fi thermostats, UV air treatment, etc. And then finally, the last part of this is your warnings and important notices, like heat exchanger compromised. This is what you wish they would put in that work order, but they forgot to, or they didn't word it right. Well, we are going to type that up in advance, put it in a list, and all they have to do is select it and hit a button, and it's now in their work order. Perfect. So the only person to blame is whoever wrote these. As long as they go select them, they're covered. You would also have descriptions for things like, I told them so. So you'd have descriptions for things such as, I highly recommended a leak search, but it was declined, etc. And you get the idea. That is one of the best pieces of advice that I have given people over the years, is to pre-write these descriptions and use that feature in mobile. That and searching. So I think that between solving people's searching problems and showing them how to use the pre-written descriptions, I think that's some of the best advice people can get on using the app. All right, so we are at the top of the hour. This is where I wanted to stop, see if there were any questions. You might have heard my little alarm. I had it set because I tend to forget and not watch the clock. Will, did we have a question?
Yes, we have one from Andy who is wondering where can we edit these descriptions and can we get a copy of them?
Oh, yeah. So if you go into the mobile app, go to Master Lists, Task Descriptions, click on that, you will see a list of the descriptions. Now, there aren't as many in there as I have now because I add to them constantly. Whenever a scenario comes up and I think, well, I don't have a good description for that, I go in there and I add to it. So you won't have as many as I have, but you already have some of them in there. Now, if you'd like to have this document, I'll go ahead and share it with you. I'll have Will grab that. Will, if you can get that out of my folder and just attach that to the chat, then you guys will be able to download that.
We can email it.
Yeah, we can do.
And we can also email it to you as well. Another thing that we can do if you want it is, since we're on that topic, I can share with you this 9-page article on setting up your flat rate, how to make decisions on which ones to use, etc. I think that would go well with the descriptions. All right. Any other questions?
That's all we got.
All right. Key takeaways. Truck stock first. I can't tell you how important that is. It is essential that you keep your people out of the supply houses. As a former technician, I can tell you I love going to the supply houses. I don't want you to stop me from doing that. It is fun to go there. I can find out who's hiring, how much more money I can make working for somebody besides you. I can get some cold pop, some popcorn, look at some tools. I might add a few things to my order that I wasn't supposed to. None of that's good for you. I love it, but you should not. Truck stock list keeps them out of the supply houses. Again, your goal is 9 out of 10 service calls. You had everything you needed on that truck. Number 2, select a flat rate pricing method that matches your company the best. Everyone's different, so it just depends, but you'll probably rely on one system, but you'll use all 4 systems. It's really important when you make that decision to first understand the impact of an invoice item type, like what's the difference between an inventory part and a non-inventory part, and a service item, and how does that affect my accounting and job costing, if it even does. It's important to understand those things before you make your decision. The most flexible is the service item type. It's really important to make it easy for your technicians to find what they're looking for. So as you remember, I said the first thing you want to do is create good categories and assign that category to your parts, to your tasks. The next thing is the descriptions. Make sure that you're consistent. You can export to Excel, fix them up, import them back in. That alone usually takes care of the issue people have with searching. Mark your common items. You probably would have 50 things that are common, so be sure to open up those items that you sell a lot, that they search for a lot or have trouble finding, and mark it as common, and that'll help. Simplify your book. If you have a flat rate book now, look at it once in a while and just ask yourself, do I need this task? You might know this, but when you go into Total Office Manager's invoice item list, you can add a column that shows how many year-to-date you've sold and how many you've sold forever. If you just look at that column, you could start picking out things that you don't sell at all. I'd start with that. I've never sold one of these. Inactivate it. Highlight all of them. Inactivate. Then go look for something that maybe you haven't sold this year. Well, we're almost into June, right? So if you haven't sold it, maybe you won't sell it. Who knows? Maybe you didn't sell it last year. Inactivate those. So just inactivate things that you're not using, because that also makes the system easier to maintain, makes it easier on the technicians in the field. And then finally, remember, if you set your flat rate pricing system up correctly, you don't have to worry about updates. You don't have to worry about when some flat rate company from New York is going to tell you how much you pay for an inducer or a reversing valve. They don't know, and they'll never get it right. You will always be correct if you're doing good bookkeeping. Create a purchase order, find out how much it's going to cost, populate the purchase order with the price. The software asks you, do you want to update the price? That's not what you paid last time. Yes, I do. You can even tell it to quit asking and just do it automatically. If you don't know when you create a PO, it's going to want to know when you do your item receipt. Same process. Finally, when you pay the bill, that's your last opportunity. You're paying your bill. You make sure that the software agrees with the bill and the bill agrees with the PO. You're updating your prices. And then you have a policy of every night, every Friday night or whatever, we go to the invoice item list. We find that retail price update utility that James mentioned. We click a couple of buttons, everything's updated. So I would do that on a weekly basis, and I would do it at the end of any day where there was a lot of item entry or item updates. And that is it. Hopefully, any other questions you have, you'll find in my documents. I hope you find those are helpful. Appreciate you being here. Sorry for the audio trouble. On behalf of, another.
We did have two.
All right, thought I was done. Two more questions. You can go if you want to, but I'll answer these.
Sandy said, can we edit the descriptions in Tom?
No, the question was, can you edit the descriptions, the pre-written descriptions in Tom? No, it's only a mobile app feature.
And then Eric said, I am trying to add 3 levels of flat rate. First with a club agreement, second mid-cost without a club agreement, and third with overtime.
So question was trying to add 3 levels. What was it? Regular, club, no club? What was that again?
Yeah, first with a club agreement.
With a
second,
club.
Mid-cost without a club agreement, and
Mid-cost.
third with overtime.
Mid-cost without a club, and then overtime. Well, it depends on the item type that you're using. Group items, service items, etc. But in many cases, it's easy to use the copy button, create option 1, and then create a copy of it and modify it slightly for those who own the club, for those who are paying overtime. So if you have 3 levels, it usually makes sense to have 3 separate tasks for those, because it's easy to pick the correct one rather than modify one to accommodate the other level. Now, it wouldn't make sense if you had 5,000 tasks, but one of the points I wanted to make earlier was many of you are going to have 60 tasks, maybe 300. Remember, you probably have 150 items that you might use on a service call on your truck stock list, so you need 150 tasks, right? Well, if you were to triple those to accommodate 3 different price levels, that's still a manageable number, 450 tasks. The other option is to have adders, where you grab a task and add something to it for overtime, add something to it to create a discount for the club membership. That might work for you. Many people would rather just have a version of the task just for that purpose. Either way, you're not going wrong. All right, that's it for questions. Once again, James Leichter for Aptora. On behalf of everyone here, we really appreciate you, and I hope to see you in the next webinar. Thank you.